Having arrived at the so-called loot house, the two looked at each other. It's bigger than we thought, huh? Shows why they call it that. If everything in there is stolen as the name implies, there's really no helping it. Of course, since they were periodically selling things off, it probably wasn't filled to the brim with loot. Subaru thought this as he looked at the loot house, its appearance not quite fitting its coarse name as it beckoned to them. By Subaru's estimate, it was probably around the size of a convenience store. Parking lot included, it only had one floor, but it was large enough to fit 20 cars with ease. Their surroundings had changed too, the various ruins and hovels were nowhere to be seen, and behind the loot house was a giant wall. It was quite literally in the deepest part of the slums. That tall wall thing, probably the capital's border wall. Looks like we came to the very edge without realizing it. Her statement caused Subaru to idly imagine what a map of the capital might look like. It was probably square-shaped, guarded by these walls on all sides. Within those walls, perhaps in the center or the northernmost area, there would be a castle, and far away from there one could find these slums. He felt like it had been 2 or 3 hours since they started their search, so he had an idea as to the capital's size. But then, if he compared it to Japan, which didn't have such clear divisions, its size wasn't really comparable. Well then, if the rumors are true, the owner of the place should be in there, but, considering our position, how do we approach this? I'll be upfront about it. I had something stolen, so return it if it's in here, that sort of thing. Subaru insisted that this wouldn't work any number of times, but she refused to listen. She was virtuous to her core. She couldn't bring herself to consider using twisted means so easily. But it was precisely because she was the kind of girl that she stopped to help Subaru even though it brought her no benefit. Ah, got it. Then, leave this to me. There was a high possibility that things would go south, so Subaru reluctantly offered to go himself. His last resort, this was too hasty, so it didn't really feel like a trump card, but it would also be a problem to lose the timing entirely. Subaru wouldn't hesitate when it came to such matters. Meanwhile, Sattler seemed puzzled by this suggestion. His newfound confidence made her look at him with suspicion. All right, I'm counting on you. I get that you can't agree just like that. After all, I myself understand that I haven't done anything to win your trust. But I do have an idea, so try to believe in it. Why are you so surprised? I mean, this is completely different from the typical pattern, isn't it? Exclamation mark. Leave it to a good-for-nothing like you, who can barely even talk to others. Don't make me laugh, even a dog would be better. I was prepared to hear something like that. As if I'd say something so terrible. His paranoia had offended her. However, she cleared her throat and fixed her amethyst eyes on him. It's true that you haven't been particularly useful thus far, and you haven't done or said anything to inspire any sort of confidence, but what kind of appraisal is that? I can't refute it, though. But I believe you think things through, and I don't think you're a liar. She stopped his self-deprecation in its tracks, and then took a breath and continued, I'll try believing in you. It'd be a great stroke of luck if you actually succeeded. Instead of that last part, something like, do your best for my sake, would really get me motivated, you know. I can't be that demanding. But, do your best. A girl who could not lie, in every sense of the phrase. Subaru responded with a broad smile and turned toward the entrance. This definitely wasn't easy on him, but he felt like her expectations and that little bit of trust were giving him the push he needed. If he came back without accomplishing anything, he really would be completely useless. As he walked, Subaru looked at the plastic bag in his hand, which had never once become the topic of conversation thus far. Within it were the items he'd brought with him from the other world. As far as Subaru was concerned, they were all that he had in this world. He might be able to barter with them. He didn't know how much this insignia was worth, but surely it couldn't be more than his cell phone, which would be the only one of its kind in this world. This would be a great loss for him, but negotiation should be possible if he used them to trade. That was the last resort he'd kept secret from her. Of course, he also had a bunch of cards that would be useless in this world. If he had the chance to use them, he should do so. Is anyone home? Standing before the wooden door, he tried knocking on it. The sound was deeper than he expected, but there was no response from within. He hesitantly reached for the handle, and the door readily opened as if there were no lock on it. The interior had no lighting, it was so dark that one could only fumble around. It was supposed to be a place where stolen goods were stored, and yet for some reason there was no one standing guard. Maybe they're in the toilet or something. Anybody there? Subaru poked his head in to look around, but not even the moonlight reached the room, leaving it pitch black. As he was welcomed by stale air and an unpleasant odor, Subaru built up his resolve and took a step forward. But first, he turned to Sattler. If the two of us walk in just like that, we might look like burglars. How about you stay out here? Are you sure? Perhaps I ought to be the one. I've already called out a bunch, so I probably won't be cut down just like that. It'd be dangerous if the owner were to misunderstand, so please leave it to me. Subaru bowed his head to her as she contemplated this. She then reached into her robe and pulled out a white crystal which she held out toward him. You should at least have some light. Whether or not someone's there, call out to me. I understand. Carefully, how do I turn this thing on? You don't even know how to use lagmite. You really are ignorant, she said in a tone that was both amused and surprised as she lightly struck the lagmite against the wall, causing it to produce a pale white glow. It was very dim, barely illuminating a few meters at most, but it would be enough to discern imminent danger. These days most people use mana-based lights instead, but this is a lot simpler and I quite like it. If it goes out, just do that again and it'll light up. I see, seems pretty convenient. Alright, I'll head in for a bit. Lagmite in hand, Subaru timidly walked in. Don't force yourself, Sattler said from behind him, and he responded by raising his hand. When Subaru passed the entrance, a small counter entered his dim field of view. Perhaps this place was originally a tavern or something. On the other side were some broken boxes. One might guess that the owner or someone else had been sitting there. The counter also seemed to play the role of a reception desk, and had various items on it. Small boxes, jars, and all sorts of blades were carelessly strewn about. He was in the dark in both the physical sense and the intellectual sense, so he couldn't hazard a guess as to their worth, but to the untrained eye they definitely didn't look very valuable. I suppose it's obvious, the valuables must be further inward. The stolen items also had wooden tags attached. It seemed like characters had been carved into these with something sharp. According to what the man from before had said, these were probably the names of the thieves who had stolen them. It seemed like they could catch all of these guys in one shot if they just gathered these up and handed them over to the guards. Well, there's also the possibility that they're using fake names. And in a situation like this, there's plotlines where the country has a dark side that's in cahoots with the criminals. There was also the question of just where these stolen goods were going. He could just skim ahead if this were a novel or manga, such were his detestable thoughts as he walked further inward. There was still no signs of life, but even with his dim light he could make out that the goods were increasing in size and value as he went deeper. An insignia with a jewel embedded in it would surely be all the way in the back, then. As he thought this, his footsteps unintentionally quickened and then, Subaru stopped when he suddenly felt something strange under his shoes. It wasn't the discomfort of stepping on something hard. On the contrary, whatever he had stepped on had some give. It felt like he'd stepped on something sticky. When he raised his leg and felt the sole of his sneaker, he noticed a thick liquid sticking to it. When his finger felt its strange stiffness, he felt a primal fear surge from within. What is this? He brought his finger to his nose to smell it, but the stale air prevented him from realizing exactly what it was. Even so, he simply didn't have the courage to bring it to his mouth for a taste. He rubbed it off on the wall, and pointed his light forward as if prompted by his unease. At his destination was the source. His voice leaked out when he finally saw it. Under the dim light, what he first saw was an arm sloppily lying on the ground. Its fingers were open as if reaching for something, and strangely, there was nothing above the elbow. He raised his light as if to look for the rest of it, and there he found a leg. Perhaps it was fortunate that the leg was still attached to the torso, and the body had most of the parts it was supposed to have. With a torn-up neck and a missing arm, what lay before him was the corpse of a large old man. Once he realized this, his mouth produced a meaningless noise. What filled his mind right now was not fear, despair, or shock. His mind was overwhelmingly blank, all thought had completely ceased. Even the options to run or stay did not exist in his brain. The blankness simply had him stand stock still until his brain fully absorbed the sight before him. This would ultimately decide his fate. You saw it. I have no choice then. Yes, no choice at all. A woman's voice, he thought. Low and cold, and somehow enjoying herself, he felt. He didn't even have time to turn around. The instant he decided to turn toward the voice, he was blown away by a colossal impact. His back slammed against the wall, knocking the lagmite out of his hand, which left him in complete darkness. But that wasn't what Subaru was focused on. His entire consciousness was devoted to goo. Hot. He felt a terrible heat coursing through his entire body. This is really bad. He felt the hard floor against his cheek, and realized that he had collapsed onto his face. His strength was completely gone, and he had already lost sensation in his fingers. The heat from his core was so excruciating it made him want to tear his throat out. Hot. The moment he opened his mouth to scream, what spilled forth was no shriek, it was a clump of blood. He vomited up large quantities of his lifeblood as he coughed. Frothy blood started foaming up at the corners of his mouth as he gurgled. Within his dim field of view, the ground had been dyed red. This is all my blood. There was enough to soak his fallen body. Blood comprises about 8% of the human body, and it is said that losing about a third of that would be life-threatening, but it seemed to him that he'd already lost just about all of it. He had stopped vomiting blood, but the heat that felt as though it would incinerate him still persisted. He moved his hand toward his abdomen with great difficulty, and having felt an impossible sensation there, he understood. My stomach's been torn open. It was no wonder he felt so hot. It seemed his brain had confused pain for heat. He was almost torn in half, only a bit of skin at his back held him together. In short, it seemed that this was checkmate for him. The moment he realized this, his consciousness started fading. Even the heat which was making him writhe in agony had disappeared, even the unpleasant feeling of blood and the sensation in the hand he'd used to feel his organs, it was all fading away along with his consciousness. All that was left was his body, which would not be able to accompany his soul. This body used the last of its disappearing consciousness to he tried to move, just a little. His head tilted upward, heavy with the weight of pain and fading strength. Black shoes disturbed the crimson pool spreading before his eyes, sending ripples through the blood. Someone was there, the one who killed him, most likely. Strangely, he felt no urge to see their face. This was the person who had taken his life, yet he chose to remain a silent spectator to his own demise. But then, something changed. A faint, metallic clank echoed within him, sharp and unnatural. A dull, throbbing pulse emanated from his core, followed by the appearance of a glowing, otherworldly ring. The ring spun slowly at first, a faint hum accompanying its movement, and then it latched onto his torso like a vice. The vibrations deepened, resonating through his battered frame as the ring rotated faster, glowing brighter with every turn. His flesh responded violently to the rhythm. With each clank of the ring's motion, strands of blood vessels and sinew stretched and wound themselves together, mending the gaping wounds in his body. The stitching was grotesque, visceral, the very fabric of his being clawing itself back together as though refusing to let go of life. Pain seared through him, followed by an intense warmth that both burned and healed. Through it all, his mind anchored itself to a single thought: the girl. He didn't know who this person looming over him was, and right now, he didn't care. His only wish was for her safety. Was she alive, far from this chaos, or was she next? The clank of the ring's motion grew louder, more insistent, as his body stitched itself with relentless precision. Torn flesh folded together, jagged wounds sealed shut, and his limbs regained their strength, though his thoughts refused to leave her. If his body could keep this up, if he could claw his way back to his feet, he'd make sure she was safe. Nothing else mattered. The killer stood motionless, either oblivious to what was unfolding or simply watching in silence. His vision sharpened as the warmth surged through his body, filling him with life once more. The ring spun faster now, its glow steady, its rhythm relentless. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Not until he knew she was out of harm's way.